Okay, it is time to begin class. Please make your way to your seats. Thank you to everyone who helped last night. It was madness. I say that. It was madness for like the first hour, and then it petered off. But it was a steady stream of kids. Haley said something, probably like 500 kids or something, because we were the only game in town, so that's what happened. Anyway, thanks for everybody who helped with that. There was something else I was going to announce. I don't know if they just can't hear me in the foyer or what. Bob will go get them. Go tell them all it's time, Bob. No, he's not going in there. He's leaving. All right. Whoa. I've been elevated. Page 46. Seems high, but... Page 46. We're mostly done with Acts chapter 12. We're with the story of Herod. Acts chapter 12, if you want to turn there. I do want to reiterate, if you need the class material, you can download it on the church website. We have a new section up at the top called Media, and you'll see the Acts notebook. So we read, let's read this again to kind of get back in the flow of the text. Acts chapter 12, beginning in verse 20. Acts 12, beginning in verse 20. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they came to him in one accord, having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain. They asked for peace, because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat upon the throne, and delivered oration to them, and the people were shouting, "The voice of a God and not a man." Immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down, because he did not give God the glory. He was eaten by worms and breathed his last. And the word of God increased and multiplied. All right, so kind of getting back in the flow of this. Of course, Herod puts who to death earlier in the chapter? Who did Herod kill? One of the Jameses. And then later on in the chapter, he arrests who? Peter, who is saved by an angel, right? And of course he goes to there's a story of him at the gate and it's locked, and there nobody believes the lady who says that Peter's back. And anyway, so as we think about the text here, let's see. I think we did every question except the last one on page 46. The death of Herod, number 2. Why did God kill Herod? Yeah, the text is very clear about that, right? The angel of the Lord an angel of the Lord kills Herod because he did not give God the glory. It says struck him down, and he was eaten by worms. So why does God not do that? Do that to everyone who does what Herod does? Why does God not do that to every ruler who does not give God the glory? Huh? Yes, that's actually a pretty good point. There'd be no rulers, right? How many rulers in history gave God the glory? Well, we could think of maybe a couple. Carl? Okay, so maybe it's retribution for killing James. Although there's been a lot of people in history who have killed Christians who didn't get put to death. It just is a weird situation, right? And the reason I ask this question, there really isn't an answer. There's not really an answer. We do see in the Bible, we see a lot of instances of God very explicitly, that's not the right word, very supernaturally, let's put it that way, God directly intervening in the lives of rulers, of even of earthly nations, right? Not even just of Israel, because of their resistance to his will, because they elevate themselves above God. And there's also a lot of instances, even in biblical history, of the time frame of biblical history, of people who did that, who just lived out their natural lives and died of old age. I mean, it happens all the time. So the question, why does God not do this today? Well, there is another answer, and the answer is, how do you know he doesn't? Right? I don't know. He might be doing stuff like this today. How would we know? We wouldn't. That's the answer. We would not know. Huh? There are. There's a lot of tyrants. There's a lot of despots. There's a lot of bad rulers even today. It's not appreciably different than it was in history. Like, just this is the way people are, right? I don't know who, I remember I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. I don't remember who it was. This is just how people are, especially earthly rulers. This is just how it usually goes. That earthly rulers, even if they're not bad rulers, earthly rulers on the whole do not worship God, do not follow God's will. Just is what it is. So when we think about God intervening in this case, I think there are some things going on in the first century that are eternally important. What are they? What are the things that are happening in the first century that need to follow a specific plan for the future? Okay, we see Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. That's a thing that has to happen. So I'm thinking God's probably intervening to make that happen. What else? Yes. The ultimate formation of this, right, of the New Testament. Okay, well, that's a thing that has to happen not just for them, but for who? Yeah, us is an answer. Everybody that comes after, right? Us is included in that, but also our children and the world throughout history. So I think there are some times in history where God intervenes in a direct way because there are things that he really wants to accomplish in a specific way for the future of the church, the future of his kingdom. And the answer ultimately is he might be doing that today, but we would not really ever know, right? We wouldn't have any idea. So what are we supposed to do with that? How are we supposed to respond to that? To the fact that we don't know if God's doing stuff like that today. What should our response or our thought about that be? Maybe I'm not asking the question well. What attitude should we have about that? Carl? Faith. Oh, he did it. Good job, Carl. I trust, even if I don't know specifically what God is doing in terms of earthly governments, I trust that God knows what he's doing, and he is acting according to the best interest of what? His kingdom, right? His kingdom. So I trust that, even if I don't know how the mechanics of that are playing out. I don't have any idea. I've never even thought about that question. I can look that up for you later and we can talk about it, but I don't have any idea right now. Let me just see. You can just Google it, because Google's trustworthy, surely. How many is every instance of Herod in the New Testament the same Herod? That's true. There is a Herod the Great that already died. Oh, look. How many Herods are there in the Bible? This is a question that somebody has already asked. Herod the Great rules from 37 to 4 BC. So he dead. Then there's Herod Archelaus. He's BC 4 to AD 6. I guess it's 4 BC to AD 6. Then there's Herod Antipas, who is 4 BC to AD 39. He's mentioned in Luke 13:32. He kills John the Baptist. He's part of the trial of Jesus. There's Herod Philip the Tetrarch. I don't know if he's mentioned. Herod Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa. The answer is no to your question. There are numerous Herods. Yeah, numerous Herods. This is probably, who is this one? This is Herod Agrippa I. That's who this is. Herod Agrippa I, followed by Herod Agrippa II, who dies around 93. So now we know. Good question. Oh, the power of the internet. That's true. Outside of there are other provinces outside of the one where Jerusalem is that Herod's control. Herod is not an uncommon name. Let's put it that way. So there's plenty of Herods. Okay, let's see here. Let's look at these in the box on page 46. There's a couple of these I want to talk about. Down on the digging deeper. So what is the answered prayer in Acts 12? How does God answer prayer in Acts 12? Does anybody remember? Peter, right? They're in whose house? The house of, does anybody remember? John Mark's mama. They're in the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, verse 12. They're all praying. Gathered together, we're praying. Presumably praying because Peter's been arrested, right? They're praying for Peter to be released. God answers that prayer. Peter's released. Is there any reason why God wouldn't answer prayer like that today? I heard like a mumble over here. No, I mean, God would still do this, right? God would still do this, right? This is a very consistent model of answered prayer. Here's the question. Who just died? James just died. So how do you think James's family feels when James is killed and Peter is miraculously rescued? I mean, seriously, how do you think James's family feels about that? Do you think there's maybe a danger of bitterness? Say it again. Yeah, John was his brother, is what Don is saying. So one guy gets killed, another is saved, very supernaturally. I don't know, maybe I'm the only one who would think this. I kind of would be like, you did that for Peter, why not for James, right? You sent an angel to rescue Peter, why didn't you send an angel to rescue James? This is not materially different than questions we have today, right? About why certain people die and other people don't. People get cancer and some people recover and some people don't. And there is, I think, a great danger of bitterness when somebody else's prayers are answered or yours are not, right? Larry? Yes. Yeah, John 21. Let's read that. This is what Larry is referencing. John 21, beginning in verse 20. So this is after Jesus has confronted Peter about the betrayal, right, and the feeding of the sheep thing. Verse 20. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had leaned back against him during the supper and had said, "Who is it that's going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" Right? This is after Jesus has said you're going to go be led where you don't want to go, and that's how you're going to die. What about this man? Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" What's the implied answer? Yeah, nothing. That's nothing to you, right? Yeah, don't worry about it. You follow me. So the saying was spread abroad among the brothers that the disciple would not die, yet Jesus did not say that he was not to die, But if my will is that he remain until I come, what is this to you? This is the disciple who's bearing witness about these things. Of course, this is John. And so Jesus pointed to Peter there, okay, even if I want him to live forever, and John's very clear that's not what was going to happen, right? But even if I want him to live forever, don't worry about it. You're going to die, and even if I don't want him to die, that's not what you're supposed to be concerned about. Now, is that easy? Oh, man, that attitude is so hard. Carl? Yeah, the thorn in the flesh, right? When he says, I urgently prayed 3 times to the Lord for him to remove the thorn from me, whatever the thorn was. And the Lord says, basically, no, I'm not going to do that. So when we think about answered prayer, oh, you weren't done. Go ahead. Yeah, that's what Jesus says. My grace is sufficient for you. So when we think about answered prayer, in Acts chapter 12 especially, okay, James is killed, Peter is rescued, and then Herod dies. Well, that brings us to another question about this. How do you think the church felt about Herod's death? Vindicated, maybe? Maybe relieved? Okay, so maybe they're thinking there's not going to be more persecution. I got to imagine James's family feels a little bit of satisfaction, maybe gratification. Dance on his grave. Yeah, seriously. This guy just killed James. Now he's been killed. And I think the church would know, because Luke knows. Now, it's hard to know maybe. Maybe the church doesn't know that it was an angel that did it. Of course, Luke knows later on, so eventually the church would find out when Luke writes this letter. But I presume they probably know immediately that this was an angel that did it, although, I don't know, maybe they don't know. How should we feel when the enemies of God's kingdom die? Yeah, it's a mixed emotion, right? One of the things that makes us human is the ability to feel multiple things at once, even things that are conflicting, right? Lee and then George. Yeah. Yes, there's very much a range of emotion. Did I say George was next? Yeah, so let's sum up a bit for people who didn't hear. The overall prevailing idea, okay, it's a mixed thing. We feel maybe some of the same sort of satisfaction or relief maybe that there's not going to be any more persecution. But the idea of sadness, which both Bob and George brought up, sadness over a lost soul. And when you think about judging, the word judgment, of course, we know Jesus is the judge, the righteous judge. God's going to judge. At the end of the day, for us, I think the predominant emotion should be sadness. That's not going to mean that we don't feel the other things, right? Again, especially when there's massive amounts of persecution. It doesn't matter as much not matter, that's not the right word. It's not as relevant for us because there's not somebody like Herod in our lives. There's not. There's not. There's nobody like Herod in our lives who is literally arresting and killing people that we know. Now, that's happening in other parts of the world. That does happen. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. But for us personally, not happening. So when we think about this is happening in other parts of the world, I don't think there's any way not to feel relief. I just don't think that human part of us, we feel that relief when a persecutor of the church dies. But if that's the only thing you feel is the relief or the thankfulness that it's over, if that's the only thing that you feel, then you don't really understand eternity. And I don't think you really understand the love of God, right? Who sent Jesus to die for whoever it was that's persecuting the church. So I think God feels a great amount of sadness over lost souls. And I think we need to as well. Not that we're not going to feel the other stuff too. Carl? Yeah. There's a lot we don't know. We don't know how the person, the intimate details of their life, whether they had a chance to respond to the gospel, whether they were ever taught. But at the end of the day, I think it is this mixed amount of emotions. And for us, I think we need to cultivate in our hearts sadness for the lost. Why should we cultivate that? After I answer this, I'll come back to you. Why should we cultivate sadness for the lost? Absolutely. That's what motivates evangelism, or one of the things that motivates evangelism. If you're not cultivating that sort of response in your heart, you're going to have a much harder time being motivated to talk to your friends about Jesus, right? You're talking to your friends about the gospel. BJ. Yeah, there is a great regret for not only the loss of a soul, but the life that could have been lived in service to God, right? There is that regret for sure. All right, any other comments about that before we move on to the next section? Yeah. What Don is saying, like when there's news that a terrorist has been killed and people cheer. Okay. Again, and the complex range of human emotion. I don't know about cheering necessarily, but there is relief that evil is not going to be perpetrated in the world anymore. But again, that just should not be the only thing that you feel. Is there a hand over here? Did I see? No. No. Okay. So we're in the next section, part 3. So we have had does anybody remember the previous 2 sections? What were the previous 2 sections? Does anybody remember how we're framing these parts of Acts? Yeah, based on Jesus' words in Acts, I think it's in Acts 1. Acts 1 verse 8. You will be receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. That's how we're framing the book. So the first 8 chapters were Jerusalem. And then the chapters 8 through 12, which is the shortest section, was Judea and Samaria. And now we're going to the end of the earth in the last section as we begin in chapter 12:25. It's really chapter 12:25 is the section start. So I got a couple of charts here that I want to look at. On page 49 is the first one, which I was looking over it this morning, is incomplete, and I'm going to have to give you a new page. Fortunately, I could just print out page 49 and 50 and give it to you, because I'm missing some books. There are some books that I overlooked on this chart. Anyway, these are the sort of a timeline of the books written during the time period of Acts. So we have James being the first by a significant margin. And these are ranges, right? There's approximate dates. It's hard to pin down exactly when. Some of them we know pretty good, but some of them are wider ranges. So James from Jerusalem, and then Galatians is going to be the first one, probably, that is written in this next section of Acts. James, the letter, that's not the right way of saying this. The epistle of James has already been written by this point. And we're going to see yellow is written by Paul. Mark is green because he's just different. I've got Mark and Peter in sort of a similar vein because a lot of people really think that Mark got his information from Peter for writing his gospel. That he was talking to Peter and getting information from Peter, and really Peter contributed a lot to Mark's gospel. And then we have Matthew in the 50s and 60s. John is way later. John's not on here. John and John's letters are not on here because they're way later than this. I'm missing Jude, and I'm missing, ironically, Luke. Are both missing from this list, so I'll make a new list. If you want to go to the next page, there is the overall chart. This is all the New Testament writings. There are a lot of question marks on this chart. It's not really a good way for this to be on here. There's a lot of question marks on this chart. This is on page 50 now. Of where things were written, there's a lot of, like Mark, for example, in the 50s. Well, that's 10 years. That could be, there's a wide range there. And so where things are written and so forth, again, it's hard to pin down exactly some of these things. So that just is a reference for you. As we're going through the next section, you'll see, other than James, of course, the bulk of the writing of the New Testament is taking place during the next section of Acts, right? Acts 13 through the end of the book is the majority of books, not by volume, but the majority of the books that are written in the New Testament are written during this time period. So we're going to see as we go through this, I'm going to try to point out as we go through the next section, when things were written, where they were written from, where they were written to, and we're going to hopefully see how these things connect, how these books connect to the events that are happening in the first century church. And we're going to see that, of course, as we go through the narrative in Acts. The Acts forms the sort of narrative backbone, and then all of these books are written surrounding these events, right? So beginning with Galatians will be the first one, which is written probably shortly after this first mission. So we see on page 51 here, the first mission. I've said this before, I'm going to iterate it again, maybe for those who are online who didn't hear this the first time. I took these charts from a guy named Mark Barry. There's a disclaimer at the front of the notebook. Please do not copy and distribute these without his permission. I got permission to use these in this class, but I took them from him. I did not make these. I think they are really well done. So the first mission, Acts 13, 4 through 14, 28. This is on page 51. We have, the reason I like this is he's got the box at the side there where he sort of walks through the different verses that mention the different places. And we'll sort of see this as we read through. We're not going to, let's see, how much are we going to read first? No, we're not quite there to it yet, but I have it right here to reference. You'll see that mission trip. Now, I've got the whole Mediterranean world. Eventually, where does Paul end up? Way over in Rome. And you'll see as we go through these mission trips, starting in Antioch, right? He goes further and further and further until eventually he goes over to Rome. Which, again, what part of Jesus' promise is that fulfilling? What did Jesus promise that Paul would do? Be his witness even to kings, and I think even to Caesar. It's what he promises him. So this is, again, an important fulfillment of God's plan for Paul. Now, here's a question. This is not in the notebook. It's a question that I've been thinking about. Why did God pick a Jew to go preach to the Gentiles? Okay, so he would have had a lot of knowledge of God based on his background, his Jewish upbringing. Okay, so maybe it's a matter of unity, right? This is a symbolic thing, that it's not like we're keeping the churches separate, right? That there's the Jewish missionaries and the Gentile missionaries. Who does Paul take on his journeys predominantly? Let's list some of the people. Who are some of the people that Paul takes? Okay, Timothy, Silas, Paul, Barnabas. Is there anybody else? John Mark, one time, really. Luke, takes Luke along. Okay, and predominantly, most of them are Jewish, with the exception of who? Who are the notable exceptions? Timothy is half Gentile, right? He's got a Gentile father. So, I've been thinking about this. I've had several discussions with people recently about it, so I'm sort of wanted to cover this. I think there is a notable lesson, especially as you go through Acts. Acts is full of this. And it is one of the predominant themes of Acts, is the idea that the Jews should not be separated from the Gentiles anymore. Okay, why? There is no distinction. There is no longer any distinction. And Peter, of course, we talked about this a lot in Acts 10, and I'm going to keep hammering this point home because Acts does. Acts does it all the time. Okay, who predominantly lives in Antioch? Gentiles predominantly live in Antioch, which means that it is a Gentile, mostly Gentile congregation, probably, that is overseer, that oversees the work, the mission work that Paul's going to do. Now, we're going to talk about the framing of this and the sort of organizational structure of the mission work in just a minute. But I do think it's significant that God does not pick a Gentile to go preach to the Gentiles. This is a designed thing to foster a new attitude in the Jews. An attitude that they're going to have a hard time getting over. We've already seen it. They have a hard time getting over it. Of not being segregated anymore. This is, I think, an important message, not just for them, but for every generation of Christian that has ever lived and ever will live. So, we come to Acts chapter 13. Galatians, I've said already, as you look at the related scriptures, Galatians is possibly written shortly after this trip. The reason I wanted to look at that chart here, you can see on the chart here, on page 51, not the chart, the map on page 51. I hope you can see it. I hope it's big enough text. You can see where Galatia is, sort of on the right third of the page, above the red lines, right? You can see where Galatia is. So he's going to a bunch of Galatian churches on this trip, right? So we have Derbe and Iconium, and that might be, there's Lystra. I think that's Lystra there. It's a little bit hard to read there because it's so compact. But so he's going to some Galatian churches on this trip. And it makes sense then that he gets back and he writes a letter to the Galatian churches, right? And that's what is going to happen in most of the writing of the New Testament, is Paul goes to a place, he establishes a relationship, he goes to a different place, he hears about something that's going on in these churches that he's visited, and he writes them a letter to do what? So some is encouragement. Maybe instruction or correction. It depends. It depends what's going on. Some it's rebuke. There's some rebuke in the letters. And I really try to stress this a lot. These letters did not just sort of fall out of heaven fully formed. These are things that were written to real people with real problems, with real instruction and encouragement that were built on a relationship that Paul had with these people, right? These were very personal things. So when we think about the instruction in the New Testament, these instructions were written for practical reasons of people like you and me, people who are in a congregation, who are trying to serve God, we're trying to do the best that we can. And how do we do that? Well, this is what the letters are for, to tell us how to do that, right? And if there's something wrong, then, well, there's some rebuke for us. If there's some encouragement that we need, well, there's some encouragement for us. And if we don't know what to do, well, then we know what to do because it was written for us, right? So, Acts 13, 1 through 3. We're going to read the laying on of hands stuff in just a minute. Acts 13, 1 through 3 as we get into this. Actually, let's begin in verse 25 of chapter 12, the previous verse. Acts 12, 25. Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had completed their service. What service? What were they doing? Yes, famine relief. This is famine relief. This is back in Acts 11, verse 29. The disciples determined every one according to his ability to send relief to the brothers living in Judea, and they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. So they come back. They go off, and then while they're doing stuff, chapter 12 happens, and then verse 25, they come back, and they bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark, who was introduced when? It was his house that Peter goes to, right? They're all gathered there, and Peter goes there. We don't know this for a fact, but it is very possible that Paul and Barnabas are there when Peter shows up. We don't know that for a fact, but it is a possibility based on the timing of things. So they take John Mark with them back to Antioch. Now, there were in the church, chapter 13, verse 1. There were in the church at Antioch, we got 10 minutes, prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who is called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, this is another Herod, and Saul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." Then after fasting and praying, they laid their hands on them and sent them off. All right, why were they fasting? Verse 2, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting. Nobody knows. Maybe they were all obese and needed to lose weight. Yes, this is not an unusual thing. This is a thing that people did, especially Jews in that time. What was the point of fasting? It's not for health reasons, I'll just tell you that. What is the point of the fasting? Okay, it's tied to meditation. Yeah, means of focusing on God's will. It is a practice of self-denial that you're demonstrating to God in your period of whatever the time that you're doing it for. Usually not a long time. Of course, Jesus does it for a super long time, that one time, but usually not a very long time. But it is a demonstration of your focus and your dedication and your will as you're approaching God and thinking about godly things and spending time with God. It is a denial of the flesh in order to heighten the spiritual endeavor, whatever the spiritual endeavor happens to be. In this case, what are they doing? They're worshiping and fasting, and I think they're praying too. Probably praying. Does it say that they're praying? No, they prayed after, but they're probably praying too. So they're worshiping the Lord and fasting. This is probably not just a thing that was happening for one day. It probably was multiple days, and so they're in a period of intense meditation and dedication and worship of God. That's what they're doing here. Now, why were they doing that? We can only speculate as to the reason. Maybe they are seeking God's will. What does God want us to do next? That is sort of borne out by what happens, right? The Spirit tells them what to do next. Maybe they were in the habit of doing this every so often. This is a reset, a refocus. I don't know. Could be any number of things. Is there any sort of practical application we should draw from this? Who else talked about fasting? Yeah. What did Jesus say about fasting? When you fast, it's interesting that word when is doing a lot of work there. What does when mean? As opposed to what other word? Yeah, it's not if. When you fast, do what? Yeah, let's read that in Matthew. I think it's in Matthew 6. Let's read it. Matthew 6, verse 16. And when you fast, do not look gloomy. I love that word, gloomy. Just, woe is me. Can you believe? You'll never believe what I did last night. I didn't eat anything, right? That's sort of, you're making yourself look bad because you want people to know about it. When you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, I don't know, they're not doing it in secret. How do we know that? In chapter 13. They're doing it together, right? So now maybe they could be presenting a normal way of life to the rest of the world, right? But this is something that is clearly happening in this group. We've got Barnabas and Simeon and Lucius and Manaen and Saul, right? So this group, they're doing that. Maybe they're doing it as sort of the leaders of the congregation, and they're trying to dedicate themselves to leadership. Any number of things. Here's the question: why don't we do this? I'll ask you that. What does constitute an apostolic example? Some of us maybe have done it. Then this is a question, right? Now, there's two questions, because there's the individual, which I don't know if you've done it or not. Who knows? I can't remember a time where we've done it as a group. Have we ever done it as a group? In Ponca, they did it. So some of us have done it. And it's interesting. How do I say this? This seems to be a sort of a regular part of especially Jewish life, but it's a regular part of Jewish life that seemed to transition into the church. Right? It's not something that just sort of died with the old covenant. This is something that they seemingly persisted in doing. Now, in the Jewish life, there was a whole bunch of regulations for it. They did all the time, right? You can read a bunch of instances of this in the Old Testament, usually accompanied by what in the Old Testament? Yeah, the sackcloth and ashes, right? And the idea of there's an assumption of fasting, and Jesus sort of does go against the grain of Jewish fasting, right? Accompanied by the sackcloth and ashes and the wailing and so on and so forth. Jesus' point is what? Well, don't do that. Do what instead? Just be normal about it, right? Because, again, the idea of connecting yourself to God and not to others, right? This is not about how holy you are. How holy you are seen to be. This is about your dedication in your relationship with the Lord. So, is that you have a hand up? No. I think you just keep adjusting your face mask, and I keep thinking you have a hand out of the corner of your eye, and my eye. There's a bunch of stuff like this, example stuff, that we just, for whatever reason, don't do. What's another example of this? Okay, we use the name Church of Christ. Why do we use that name? Okay, what did you say? It's one of the names of the church in the New Testament. There's a verse really next to that verse that says what? Greet one another with a holy kiss. Well, you don't do that either. That's not even in the frame of an example. That's just a direct thing, right? That's a thing that we're told to do. We don't do that either. Okay, here's my point about this. When you think about the actions of the early church, I suspect, as you think about especially fasting, if you've never done this before, I would suggest you try it. A period of time of self-denial in order to draw closer to God. They obviously thought, and when I say they, I'm including an apostle, they obviously thought it was a worthwhile practice. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it, right? And maybe it's something that we could even think about doing as a group, because here they're doing it as a group, right? And they're doing it, again, we don't know the reason. I really wish we knew the reason. If this was just something they did regularly as sort of part of their worship, or if it was something, usually fasting was done as sort of you had a specific goal in mind, a specific reason that you were doing it. So we don't know that here. But I do think it is something that we could think about doing more, because they did it, and again, who's doing it? It's an apostle and a prophet, right? They're doing it as leaders of God's church. So we're out of time. I knew we'd run out of time. Everybody's trying to come in. All right, we're done. People are filing in now. So we'll pick up here next week. That clock is slow. My phone says 9:47, but that says I'm still in time.